Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bergen podcast. I'm your host, Douglas Saltis, and today we continue our Budget 2022 breakdown. While last week's episode was competition focused, this week we're going to tackle the other bugaboo of Canadian tech, talent. Now, regular listeners of this podcast will be familiar with the idea that Canada is facing a significant shortage of high-skilled tech workers, and anyone alive during the last 2 years will recognize the impact that COVID has had on remote work, hybrid work, etc. So what to do about all of that? Well, in the days before the budget dropped, the federal government announced some key changes to its global talent strategy, including the development of a plan to attract and retain the world's digital nomads. What the hell does that mean? I have no idea, but thankfully the folks at CCI do, who also happen to publish some recommendations on what Canada's 21st century talent strategy should look like. So joining us today is CCI President Ben Bergen and VP Dana Oborn to talk us through. Now, talent isn't the only hot topic coming out of this budget. The federal government also announced the creation of a new Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency and Canada Growth Fund. And details on both of these orgs are slim. But that won't stop us from invoking our inner Columbo and asking just one more question. Or maybe we'll leave that to Paul Wells. Let's dig in. Thank you both for joining. I was told that CCI would no longer do any podcasts with BetaKit unless we gave you some time off the top to talk about talent. So I guess we're going to do that to start. But I guess the government did consent to or announce some interesting changes to broadly the global talent strategy just before the budget. And I do know that maybe a week prior, CCI had laid out a myriad of recommendations as to things that you would like to see happening. So I'm just wondering if we could run through first what the government is interested in doing this year, and then maybe some of the gaps or additional opportunities that you see Canadian tech companies are asking for.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Doug, and thanks so much for having us. I do want to just say before we get going, I'd like to congratulate my colleague Ben for taking this podcast in Canada, because I know all of the other podcasts that you have had, he has been out of country, and I'm ready for his burn, which will come full circle. But let's talk about talent. So indeed, you're right. We're really proud to have released a talent and skills strategy that we actually had worked on for several months, both in consultation with our members across the board. Some of it kind of came together, in larger gatherings, and then just some, piecemeal pieces that we've been hearing from our member companies across the country. And there's a lot of other organizations in Canada that are sort of starting to sing from the same songbook. So indeed, we outlined 13 recommendations that I just want to note were presented just before the budget. So there was really no time for the budget to have taken into any consideration. However, we do believe that this is sort of a living, breathing document. And I will say there's absolutely no, silver bullet to any of this stuff. So kind of in and around the same time, the government did make some changes to the global talent stream, which, proudly say that we worked on several years ago from inception to pilot to permanent program, which meant that it extended the 2-year allowance to 3, which was, I think, I would call it a game changer. And then also reduce some of the administrative burden on the LMIA process, which is the labor market assessment. So anybody who's listening from the HR world will know what I'm talking about. They also did raise the cap on a couple of the immigration numbers as well coming into Canada. And I think, all these pieces are moves to create better flow. I will say there's still, lots of companies and folks in the ecosystem talking about the slow processing, but that is starting to pick up. And I know obviously with the situation in Ukraine, some efforts have been diverted, but I think good stuff happening. And I do hope that our talent document is something that continues to kind of drive the efforts forward from the federal government, but also the provincial governments.
Yeah, you just mentioned Ukraine, and recently we had Ilya Brodsky from VanHack on, and I would not say that he has been someone who has been super positive on the way that the government has approached access to international talent, but he did say specifically when it comes to Ukraine, they've been moving relatively quickly. Now, that said, the last time we had him on was, I believe, in 2019 to talk about, I guess, the early stages of the global talent stream, still in evaluation stage, fast track visa, things like that. So I guess, the recommendations you've laid out kind of relates to the new current reality. In the budget, we noticed the government making reference multiple times to like the new digital reality, which they haven't clearly defined, but I think everyone has a general sense of like what we're living with in, the second decade of the 21st century, but just kind of this current still COVID environment. I want to maybe dig into some of those other elements that might play into that, particularly the decision to develop a digital nomad strategy, which I think, Dana, was where your chirping was directed in referencing Ben's inability to be in Canada on a Canadian tech-focused podcast. And I'm wondering if this was something similar to like the early genesis of the fast track visa, global talent strategy. This is something that you're building for CCI to take advantage of directly. But I'm wondering, what does it mean to be a digital nomad? What does it mean to have a strategy around something that is incredibly emergent and kind of breaks the traditional lines and demarcations that governments function around?
Well, since I chirped Ben on it, I think I should give him fair ground to defend himself, rightfully so. So Ben,
looking directly at Ben for this, 100%. Keep out that life.
Yeah, that's fair. So I had been, dancing around to a few different places over the last number of years, taking advantage of the fact that we can work remote, that we're not being forced to go to Ottawa for meetings or other places. So the irony in all of this, Doug, is that Dana is actually in Mexico right now, and that is why she had tacos.
Told ya.
I know
Full circle.
She did drop an Easter egg for you, but you didn't catch it.
No, I didn't want to mention it because I had agreed with your comms person prior to not bring this up. But if you guys are gonna mention it, I'll let the tacos go wherever they may lead.
Yeah. So on this digital nomad piece, I think it's just the reality of how certain individuals within the tech space are working, right? The ability to pick up, only need a laptop and basically be anywhere in the world. And I think that, Canada has some unique advantages in terms of people wanting to be here, whether it be, quality of life, individual freedoms, good mountains, wanting to go surfing in rural Nova Scotia. I mean, you name it, there's a lot of really good opportunities to be here. So why not create a visa that allows for that access? And so what we really kind of put forward is, how do you capture some of those individuals that may want to actually take advantage of that system? And what we have found is that there's a massive labor shortage in Canada, which all Canadian tech CEOs understand when it comes to highly skilled workers. So why not remove any of that potential friction of people actually wanting to relocate here? You mentioned that Ilya mentioned some of the challenges around the global skills visa, but by eliminating that with something from a digital nomad perspective, you're able to just increase the potential labor supply. To Dana's point, is it a silver bullet? Is this one policy going to fix everything? No. But potentially it does have the opportunity to create thousands of jobs here in Canada where individuals can come and work.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit in more detail, because this isn't just a different demographic or audience than some of the other kind of pathways are targeted for. And we could also talk about some of the high potential tech talent visa, like line items and things like that. But this is also just a different use case for these potential employees. And I'm wondering if it is something where we are attracting talent to work here for Canadian companies, what that looks like when by its nature, the digital nomad life might be like 3 months, 6 months, like what is the benefit that we are creating by being open for those people to be doing work here, when, to be honest, they can do a lot of that stuff anyways, as long as they're spending whatever the tax filing applicable time is in whatever their home country is. Like I'm guessing, like, are we seeing a barrier to access talent for the types of people that are just living at the various Soho houses around the world with a MacBook and just kind of like, one of those very large brim hats you see at a Soho house? Like, I guess with every other kind of talent stream initiative we've seen, it's been about breaking down a very entrenched barrier to have access to talent that is interested in coming to Canada and didn't have a feasible or expedient pathway. And this seems to be radically nascent and possibly not. I struggle to see the value in this for Canadian businesses. So I'm wondering if you can just talk through the use case, or is this why the government's looking to develop a strategy around it to understand it better?
Yeah, so I think a couple pieces here. I think when you're thinking about people's mobility, I think you're probably thinking of it really in a kind of European or North American context as a citizen, right? There's lots of people from other jurisdictions where they need to get visas to enter Canada in order to actually come here, right? So how do we actually look at increasing that labor pool? So when we're looking at people from whether it be Brazil, Colombia, there is some of that access to barrier in order to come to Canada, right? Part of the idea is how do you begin to create stickiness for individuals or for couples to potentially come. And so the idea is by getting people into our communities, by actually getting them integrated into the quality of life of what it means to be Canadian, the idea is that you'll help actually keep people here and actually help grow local talent pools. And so by actually, formalizing the process and including people within, whether it be, the tax structure, which, we don't really lay out what that would look like, but wanting government to obviously invest into figuring out what that looks like, you're potentially, increasing revenue for the country from a revenue perspective, which, positive, help pay for programs, you and I care about, Doug, like healthcare and education. But really what you're doing is you're signaling to highly skilled workers that this is a place where they're welcome and where they actually have an opportunity to try and build a new life. And being able to experiment and try that for 3 to 6 months is a really kind of low stakes way of getting people into the country and begin to experiment. So, we put forward 13 recommendations, and this one really trying to actually hit the mark of where we currently find ourselves in this kind of moment of mobility and, wanting governments to definitely explore how this potentially can unlock, employment for Canadian companies.
Yeah. Okay. So that's I can get behind that. Duly noted that there could be a freemium or a rent to own kind of approach to attracting talent, because as we noted, part of the reason why we needed a fast track visa, part of the reason why VanHack exists is because it is, for most individual workers or families making the the long haul over, a significant life change or commitment. And would you see any digital nomad strategy playing into some of the current levers that are already available? Would this be something that a VanHack might be seeing? Is like, we can bring over a bunch of digital nomads, and instead of interviewing over Zoom for potential candidacies, they can be doing it in person, and we're just shifting them over to a different tracking mechanism within the government's immigration process. Do you conceive it functioning that holistically?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're already kind of starting to see that happening. And I know we mentioned earlier the Ukraine situation, but the system that they've effectively set up creates sort of an open-ended work permit. Now, I want to acknowledge that this situation with Ukraine is much different than sort of what we're talking about here. But what it definitely indicates to us is that the government of Canada is willing to try some of these strategies to help, resolve this problem. Speaking on the Ukraine issue specifically, Canada has the largest diaspora outside of Russia and Ukraine of Ukrainians, so it's only natural. But look, I think that this is sort of the beginning of how governments are going to be rethinking immigration systems in an era of remote work, right? So we all know we're not really going to see everything go back. We've seen lots of upheaval from workers when their companies have said, we want everybody back 100%. People are still uncomfortable with the rounds and waves of what's happening. And
you'll never see Ben at 111 again.
People's lives have just changed, and I think that it's now actually become a perk for people to work and, live where they want. And I read a quote the other day from, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, talking about this new era of remote work. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention other publications here, but I just did.
It's fine. They're paywall.
Yeah. A manager saying, if I have to look you in the eye to give you direction, if I have to look you in the eye in person to give you direction, you shouldn't be working here. Not an employee at the Wall Street Journal, but interviewing another person. So I think that what that indicates or that signals is that managers and supervisors are starting to actually turn a corner on the mandatory be in the office or you're not productive kind of way of life. It's not. And as we've talked about several times before, not only on this podcast, not me personally, but all companies are basically tech companies these days, right? So the shift is taking place, and it's very interesting to see how it's starting to transcend.
I want to just get to connect the point that you just made to the high potential tech talent visa, because initially when we started with the fast track visa, specifically the 2-year trial, there was a lot of questions around the language and the framing of who that was for in terms of like highly skilled workers and how generalized that was. Now, I think, the former Minister of Innovation might have been approaching that from a format of allowing some wiggle room because there weren't the specific codes for some of the talent that Canadian tech companies were trying to grab.
Yep, not codes, yep.
Yes. So this seems to be directly targeted to those groups. Talk a little bit, if every company is a tech company now, who are these high potential tech talent visa candidates for? And is this an entrenching of what was previously an experiment to have specific codes for tech?
Look, I think the rapid pace of the growth of the tech sector is just demanding it. I think it's too specific to kind of the knock code system is antiquated. We know that for sure. The system of how they address job titles, they didn't know what a UX designer was or a back end software engineer. All of these are relatively new titles, and we're seeing really creative titles come out of the tech ecosystem anyway. So there's a revision of the knock code, and for our listeners, just to make sure that they know what that acronym is, National Occupation Code. There's an adjustment, there's a modernization of it. But I think, alongside that, there also has to be sort of seismic shifting happening in the immigration system to be able to respond to the need. And, I think Ben has said this on previous podcasts, but we don't have the capacity in Canada for some of these companies to find the talent here. So borrowing ideas from different jurisdictions, borrowing people to come in and help train highly skilled people and create teams that can then go off. I mean, look at BlackBerry. They did the same thing, right? Several of the folks that work there have gone off and done amazing things. Look at Patrick Spence at Sonos. Great piece about him a couple of weeks ago. So it's about that capacity building. But I think because we still are a relatively young sort of tech ecosystem, we need to have some of that talent, borrow talent, and bring it in, upskill, and then flourish in the ecosystem. And so that's why some of these, I think, strategies by the government are really going to help address those problems, but it's still going to take time.
Okay. Yeah, it's always good to see an ex-RIM employee win a patent fight.
Mm-hmm.
So as we mentioned before, you had laid out the recommendations after the budget had been locked. But I want to talk through maybe some of the other considerations that you're laying out here that we haven't spoken to, and just work through either things that you might be speaking to the government throughout the rest of the year to consider related to maybe some of the investigations they're making, or just down the road, swing for the fences, kind of like best hopes and wishes, and what those recommendations relate to.
So we did a lot of research for this, aside from talking to our members. But one of the cool proposals that we saw or came across was a high potential tech visa. So giving our most in demand professionals a pathway to Canada without a job offer. So this kind of goes to what Ben was talking about earlier about creating that pool here. And the low stakes, come to Canada, work for, or get into the pool of candidates here, work here for maybe 6 to 12 months. This was actually a proposal that was put forward in the UK. I don't think it's been adopted, but it was, floating around out there. And so we thought that was really interesting. The other piece that we think is vital, and this kind of goes back to what you had mentioned before, Doug, is just about enhancing the targeted turnaround visa processing time to 48 hours. Now, that would require Immigration Canada to have, set service standards that are very difficult potentially to meet. Measured in hours and days rather than weeks. Exactly. But at the same time, too, flip that on the other side and say to a company who's closing a deal or needs somebody who's highly skilled, it's measured in hours or weeks for those companies in terms of whether or not they're going to be able to, get the funding or build out the MPV or whatever the case may be. So I think service standards are going to start to become really critical in the immigration system, especially on situations where you see companies that are, high growth. And look, we're ambitious. 48 hours is ambitious. Can we hit 48 hours? I don't know. But look, let's try, right? Especially on some of these things. And I think it'll do a hell of a lot for a lot of the companies that are trying to get talent into Canada.
What about talent retention? There's a lot in your recommendations that were about helping the youths, I guess, build their career within Canadian companies, which is something, I don't know, depending upon what day you read the Globe and Mail, it's either like too much time is spent trying to enable youth employment or not enough. Where does this factor in when it comes to loan repayments or ESOP plans or things like that? This is pretty nitty gritty detailed stuff, but again, directly impacts every founder of a Canadian business who's looking at this stuff for the first time when they're growing and scaling their company.
Yeah, so I mean, we put forward kind of three pieces around sort of the retention side of the equation. And so first is obviously stock options, which I know we're all very familiar with in terms of kind of CCI advocating for. And that really is just because it is one of the most powerful tools that startups and scale-ups have to be able to compete on the salary side of the equation. It's a risk, it's a gamble that the employee takes that, they may actually be worth something one day. But I think to hem in that opportunity for companies to use that tool, I think would be really a big mistake by government. So we included that piece in there to make sure that it's continued to be defended. Obviously there were changes made back, was it 2020 or 2021? It's all a blur with COVID, but there were changes made, that created certain things like CCPC status and, created a set limit in terms of valuation of the company. And those were all things that we ended up being okay with because it did protect the majority of scale up. So I think that one, let's leave it as is. And then the other two that we proposed, look at obviously, a 12-month loan repayment for new graduates who actually work at Canadian headquartered companies, right? How do we try and create incentives for students to go work for, let's say a Canadian company over a US foreign multinational, right? How do we create that slight incentive? And that's a pretty easy one. And it actually doesn't cost any money really in the long term. It maybe muddies the books a little bit from a repayment perspective over a year, but ultimately, it really doesn't cost much in terms of potentially helping drive highly skilled workers to local companies. And then, the other piece that we just looked at, and this actually comes originally from the US, is just looking at a tax advantage for firms that help repay student loans for their employees. So how do we create that benefit around kind of the education component? So there are three, I think, kind of important areas where retention can help companies keep workers and also be able to keep the talent here in Canada.
Yeah, so it's not only retention at the companies themselves, but then not looking to go to other markets potentially because one of the easiest ways to get your loans repaid is to work for a U.S. company that's willing to pay like 2 to 3x the salary. Which I guess maybe let's ladder that back up to wrap this segment high level. Every time we have CCI on, every time we talk to companies about like their number one priorities when there's kind of like major sea change events in tech, it's talent is usually the number one question. Before it was like, how do we compete with Shopify to hire people? They're hiring everyone. And then it's like, oh my God, there's 1,000 Shopifys poaching all of Canadians. What is the kind of generalized state of play when it comes to Canadian tech's considerations for talent right now? Is it more on retaining talent, completing that pipeline for international talent because there's still hiring needs? Is it a bit of a balance? Like, I don't think anyone's really solved remote work as you guys are like just chirping each other publicly on a podcast while also being color coordinated in your wardrobe. Like no one has figured out remote work perfectly. Like what's when you talk to these companies, how has the conversation changed around the problems that they're focused on solving?
Yeah, and for the record, we didn't color coordinate on purpose, but these things just happen when you work so closely with someone.
Yeah. Well, the fact that it's subconscious makes it only more compelling.
Yeah, scary even. One thing I just want to pick up on before we get to dive into your question, which I think is interesting around retention. Actually, maybe it's a good segue. ESOP, the stock options piece, is something that several companies have been offering for a very long time. And Ben's correct in citing that it was sort of a bit of a big catalyst that brought CCI together. But now we're starting to see companies give options on the options and the cash. I think it was Shopify that recently said, we'll give you options, or you can take a little more cash. So I would wager to bet it's retention, because there's this thing that kind of happens with, highly skilled people where they kind of bounce around to different tech companies and play it off each other. And I've heard of this happening sort of in the management consulting world, where they say, oh yeah, I'll stay, but I just got offered this at said competitor, and it puts the employer in a bad place. And it takes about 3 to 6 months for any employee at any organization to basically upskill themselves to really understand what the hell they're doing in their job anyway. And B, it does cost a company money to onboard people and get them up to speed. So people want to hire from within in any organization, right? That's the dream. So you can train people from the mailroom all the way up to the role of the CEO. That's the ideal. So I think it's retention. But going back to my earlier comment around just some of the nuances in the technical skills perspective that we just simply don't have a pool of in Canada is still a big part around the attraction. But
and those are machine learning PhDs,
AI, a lot of the really the really technical stuff that now companies are starting to move into. So, I think, like we said at the front end, no silver bullet, but I think it's going to be really interesting actually in the next couple of months to see how companies actually adapt to what they can offer their employees aside from just a remote work to try and keep them working, for them.
Ben, you got anything on that, or do we want to close it off, go to break?
A lot of our member companies are hiring, right? And needing to hiring lots and lots and lots of people, and they just aren't there. So I think you've got the brain drain 2.0, where you've got, people being able to work remote for Silicon Valley companies out of their, Winnipeg basements or their Saskatoon basements. So that piece is kind of causing huge problems. And you've seen some of our member companies give huge bumps in salaries to a lot of their employees just to try and keep them. And now, as things are looking to grow and expand, it's okay, who can we actually hire? So I think it's a bit of an A and a B situation. I think what we're hearing a lot though from our members, to Dana's point, is that retention component. But the question is, now that you're trying to grow, where are you going to find them?
Yeah, and it's shameful and maybe reductionary or reductive, to use the word properly, to maybe bring it all back to Shopify again. But it is telling that a company that, from the CEO's perspective, very publicly has said, you don't work at Shopify for the salary, is making changes to reportedly open up choice between cash or options, while also looking to do a stock split, while also looking to retain more voting control. Okay, that's the perfect way for us to segue into the break. Hey, the Beta Kit podcast is brought to you this week by Osler, the leading business law firm for startups, high-growth companies, and investors in Canada. Hey, including even Beta Kit. The firm has just released its Deal Points report on venture capital financings, an inaugural study of 332 anonymized Canadian venture capital and growth equity financings. Now, the report looks at deals from 2019 to 2021 and provides data and insights for founders, entrepreneurs, investors, and advisors contemplating transactions. So if you want to read the new report, you can check out the Deal Points report on venture capital financings at osler.com. That's OSLER.com. Hey, the Beta Kit podcast is also brought to you by Cisco, and Cisco wants you to join them at the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto on May 5th from 2:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time to learn all about how migrating from an on-premise phone system to the cloud is the perfect solution for your business. From easier collaboration to simpler remote work, cloud calling has you covered. At the event, you'll hear from industry experts, and attendees will get a chance to win exciting prizes. So to learn more or to register for the event, go to www.business.bullfrog.net/hockey, and we will see you at the Hockey Hall of Fame in May. Yes, we have fulfilled our contractual obligations. We have spoken to talent. Now I want to ask you about things I don't understand but do care about. And that is, well, let me take a step back. Benjamin was on the podcast recently when we were looking at some of the provincial budgets, and he made a statement that has stuck with me to this day, which is pretty rare given my advanced age, that CCI and maybe Ben more specifically are really focused on specific systemic policy changes more so than dollar commitments because they have wider reaching and generally more long-term impacts, which as we're seeing with the global talent stream that over the last 5 years has become has moved from being emergent to entrenched. At the same time, this federal government's like, we got some new shiny things, super clusters. Forget about that. They're just clusters now. We're going to give it half the money. But we have two new initiatives, the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency and the Canada Growth Fund. I want to hold the Canada Growth Fund because we should always close a podcast talking about Paul Wells. But I'm very interested in this Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency because it was generally a surprise to people tracking this because I think we were expecting, Dana, I think you called it CARPA before, but like a Canadian version of the United States DARPA program or agency. And this is not that. This is very, and was called out in the budget, specifically modeled after, I guess, like Finnish and Israeli programs. It's only a promise of like $1 billion over 5 years to the creation of this agency. It's intended to invest in innovation, research, and development at the scale required to make Canada a global leader, whatever that means. And details on the agency's operating budget are still to be determined following consultations later this year. I think it's going to be a theme for this segment. TBD later on. There's some other things that we can read on here, but I'm just wondering, one of the benefits that we have of having CCI on the podcast is pulling back a curtain to our tech-focused audience on some of the machinations of government and how decisions get made and how programs get set up. I would like you to speak to our audience about what the hell this is, what it's intended for, and how maybe we should follow these consultations and decisions on operating budget and focus, other than the fact that it will be independent and market oriented.
Okay. So, love that.
Deep breath in, deep breath out.
So that's a lot of throat clearing for like, what the fuck is this program?
I'm going to say that I'm actually cautiously optimistic about this budget and a couple of the pieces that we see here. And I will address your issue, Doug. I promise you. I do promise you. So I think when we look at the creation of the Canadian Innovation Investment Agency, we have to kind of look at some of the broader language of what the budget document is talking about, right? Budget is a skeleton and it needs to be fleshed out through consultations and through conversations. And that's kind of where CCI gets involved and spends its time. So if you're wanting to be part of helping us flesh out some of these pieces, join the—
Oh no, don't turn this into recruitment.
Join the council. But all of this is to say, I think that something that did surprise me about this budget in relation to the point that you're raising, Doug, is that the government is actually acutely aware that there is an innovation and productivity gap in this country, and that you cannot just spend more money on education and more money on basic research in order to address that. And that's actually the first time that the government, whether it be conservative or liberal, in the last 20 years has actually addressed that that's an issue. And so where I think that this money is allocated towards, hopefully, and this is me being the cautiously optimistic Ben Bergen that I can be, is that this money will actually try and go to help on the innovation side, to help firms scale up in terms of investments. And for me and for us at the council, how we describe innovation really is the commercialization of an idea, right? In a capitalist structure, that's where innovation actually flows.
Okay, so let's focus on that there, because I don't want to frame this in terms of, hey, CCI likes systemic policy changes and this is dollar commitment, so it must suck. But I do wonder, because often when we talk about this, we say two things. Canadian companies traditionally underspend on R&D. by and large. I think we mentioned BlackBerry before, and they were pretty far ahead, but still way behind relative to any of their competition back in the day. But then also the significant problem that we have in Canada is commercialization of that R&D, mostly because it's housed not within tech companies, but within campus linked, whatever, university programs and the whatnots. So I'm wondering what function or role this program and these dollars would play in that, given that like convincing companies to spend on R&D, helping with commercialization. We've talked about procurement before on this podcast. Wouldn't that be a commitment to procure commercialized stuff? I just don't know what this thing is.
Yeah, so I think the piece that obviously we're still looking at in terms of fleshing out and figuring out is how will this actually be set up as an organization, and what will be the principles behind it in terms of what they do or do not invest in. And I think that kind of two interesting comments that I'll make is one, we all kind of joked that there was going to be a DARPA or a CARPA or a Maple DARPA that was going to come out. And that actually was kind of tied to a more kind of rigid structure in terms of it being, potentially linked to projects rather than to companies. And so I think here the government is actually creating themselves a bit more leeway in terms of where those investment dollars would go. And I think if the organization that they set up is properly orientated, which this is where I get excited or disgruntled, Doug, if it's properly orientated to focus on the actual commercialization of the product, then I think there's something exciting that could come out of this. Where we've seen real challenges in the governance and the structure of government programs has been something like the superclusters, which try to kind of create this sort of amorphous group of companies coming together under some sort of assigned project to kind of move things forward. And so it really failed when you look at things like how it held and protected things like IP and data. And it also often put large foreign multinationals at the center of them.
For context, because it required large corporations to be kind of anchor programs for R&D projects and kind of doing like a very classic federal government approach of we'll dollar match work here as long as there's an adult company in the room so that we can take our eyes off this kind of approach, which led to, I would say, not for all clusters, but for most clusters, kind of like dead on arrival development of any sort of activity.
Yeah. And I think 100%. And I think that the government's, and I'll just say it, I think slow winding down of superclusters, going from superclusters to just clusters, for them only getting, half of the amount that they had originally wanted, and it being divided over 6 years. I mean, it works out to
still like $100 million a year. It's not like nothing to sneeze at, but it's
it works out to roughly $25 million a cluster, and so that I think is kind of a signal that those programs didn't actually deliver what they had anticipated, and Shred, as runs between being, a $3.5 to $4 billion program a year, depending on, how much money makes it out the door. So I think in terms of significance, the Canadian Innovation Investment Agency potentially, if properly orientated, has the potential to be useful in terms of helping companies scale and grow if innovation's at the center of it. But I think that, the larger commitment also here to reform Shred, I think is also actually a signal to my earlier comment that the government understands that they need to really figure out this productivity gap and this innovation gap for Canadian firms.
Okay. And I think noted here what we're seeing, and this was a theme within our competition focus, it seems to be truly a whole of government approach where they are looking at all the various touch points that they have to influence a decision. But I think, to restate, your concern is the devil is in the details of the implementation. We don't want to get too much into Shred because we're doing some reporting on that work. But I do know, again, it's under review again, to quote Daniel Monroe. But just tying up on the Innovation Investment Agency, how much are you, is part of your work here, or how much are you aware of the Israeli Innovation Authority or the Finnish Tix, I believe is how you pronounce it. I'm just guessing. And how much this is modeled on. Because it's pretty rare, I think, in a budget for a new program to announced by the government to say we're modeling it off of other countries' programs directly after they were the people that communicated to everyone that this would be a Canadian DARPA. So is that a little misdirect? Is that a little or did they do the work and say actually the programs that we're most interested in modeling ours after are these?
Can I just jump in really quickly because this is Ben's forte, but it's actually not uncommon that governments, particularly in Canada, do what's called a jurisdictional scan on different policies that countries around the world have kind of stood up. And I think it's important to give a nod here to Danny Bresnitz, who's done a lot of work with the federal government in the last couple of months, and of course, spoke highly of the work that the Israeli Innovation Agency, or
I think it's the Israel Innovation Agency, IIA.
Israel Innovation Authority.
Oh, authority. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a very common thing that governments will do is literally called a jurisdictional scan to look at different countries and what they do. But
how often do they note that in the budget?
They won't note it in the budget unless it's sort of like a reference term. But if there's internal government documents that are circulating in preparation for like the thinking on the policy, that will definitely, and to some extent, it's like it kind of gives people an assurance inside government that they're doing something that has been successful before, right? Like just like, maybe a group of investors saying, well, I don't know if we're going to invest in a company like this. Well, yeah, we did 10 years ago and look how much money we made. Same kind of idea. So anyway, just wanted to note that, the policy wonk on the line here knows that this is not a rarity. But Ben, I think you're better suited to answer Doug's specific question.
Yeah, I mean, I think on sort of the, I guess you feel it's a bit of a bait and switch, Doug, in terms of it going from DARPA to this new program.
Red herring. God damn it! There we go.
Yeah,
fuck.
From what I have heard within government is they did sort of look at the numbers and look at the program, and the fit just isn't for Canada in terms of how it's structured in the US. They have, billions and billions of dollars that they spend in terms of their defense spending that they then are able to, turn into commercialization and actually kind of move it forward. And if you just look at our dollar spend, it's just not there. So needing a scalpel rather than just sort of a blunt instrument is really what's needed here. And I think if you look at the Israeli and Finnish models, they've been really exact in terms of trying to actually laser focus on some of those projects. So again, to go back to kind of my earlier comment about it's really going to matter about the structure of how this thing is set up is going to matter. And if they pick, 200 projects a year that they give each $1 million to, that's not going to move the needle, right? Making sure that you're specifically tailoring and focusing on specific areas where you can actually be successful will matter. The nightmare scenario for me and Dana, often when we hear about some of these announcements, is when we get some of the bizarre regionalism that kind of comes into this. Each region has to get a specific dollar amount based on its population, right? And when you get into sort of the politicking of it, that's when things really begin to kind of fall apart. And I think superclusters was definitely subject to some of that challenge.
Let's tease that out, because we just saw that with the $4 billion digital workforce kind of commitments, which initially I think we're going to kind of go like they had kind of FedDev had worked with Digital Main Street to kind of like effectively build a program. Disclosure, my partner was working with Digital Main Street at the time. And then they decided that they needed like 30 Digital Main Streets across the country because I think their nightmare scenario, to contrast CCIs or any like human being that doesn't want to live and work in bureaucracy, their nightmare scenario is being tagged for picking winners or picking another We charity for this. So like, what's the confidence level when it comes to this being implemented in a way where it isn't carved out regionally or along specific thematic lines, because this particular government has been burned on that third rail a few times?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the governance, right? You've got to remove the political angle out of the decision making, right? So you need to firewall it, and you need to create the proper metrics in terms of measuring, what will have the correct outcomes. And so the challenge with governments is they often, want to be involved in the politicking side of the equation. And so with something like the Digital Main Street piece, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the last pod, is that, overwhelmingly, some businesses were able to receive, funding for advertising and that type of thing. But the lion's share of the money is going to go to Facebook and Google and, a few other large social platforms.
Shopify and then Fang, basically.
Yeah. And so, if you really are wanting to look at how to stimulate the economy in a meaningful way, it's about actually supporting domestic tech companies that are going to create software or create solutions. And those products actually get sold, to obviously Canadians or to Canadian companies, but then ultimately can then be exported globally. So, that's really where, when you're looking at program design, are you, just merely, making 10 cents on your dollar, or are you making, $1.10 off of your dollar? And I think that's where we really want kind of a whole of government approach. And I think that the Canadian Innovation and Investment Agency needs to really be thinking about that strategically in order for it to be considered a success, or something that the Council of Canadian Innovators would view as a success.
Okay, what about losing 10 cents on every dollar? And this is the transition to another program based upon other programs, although they're not being as direct in noting this. We're talking about the Canada Growth Fund, which was announced in the budget. The establishment of a Canada Growth Fund to attract substantial private sector investment. It comes with a problem of $15 billion over the next 5 years to attract that substantial private sector investment to help meet important national economic policy goals. Specifics of where the capital will be spent are dramatically lacking, but the budget does point to some specific climate and emission goals, which seems to be, if you read the different sections of the budget, they all seem to be kind of pointing towards that. And there's an expectation that actual details of this program will be released with the fall economic statement, which is, hey, 6 months down the road from now, if we're being generous on the assumption of like when fall starts and ends with this government. I want to, we could talk again about like what might this be about, but I think at this point I feel obligated to shout out Paul Wells, who recently struck out on his own with his own Substack, he's just been, I guess now that he doesn't have to write about conservative tweets anymore, he can just spend a couple days talking to the government about announcements they've made and kind of like follow the threads of the questions they answer or don't. I just want to read this kind of in him trying to understand what this program is about, how much money is being spent, how much money they think they're going to lose. I strongly suggest, and we'll link to in the show notes, just checking out his Substack, support good journalism, even if it comes from Paul Wells. He writes, and I quote, the instrument chosen, a growth fund plainly modeled on the Canada Infrastructure Bank, will hope for greater success luring private sector partners than the bank ever managed to attract. It will invest $15 billion, but cost only $1.5 billion, or depending on how you count these things, nothing new at all. It expects to lose only 10 cents on the dollar, even though it will be using aggressive financing instruments that are commonly thought to carry considerable risk. Paul Wells goes on and on and on as he does. What the fuck is up with this? Is probably the most detailed question I have.
Can I just, I'm so excited because I've always wanted to say this like on record, but I love an angry Paul Wells. I just love an angry Paul Wells.
Fired up Paul Wells. Yeah.
And angry for good reason, but I mean his writing on it's really interesting. And I look to Ben's point earlier, and I know we're kind of playing off of what each other are saying, but again, this is what happens when you spend too much time together and share a brain and a wardrobe allegedly. Is that
but not the same city, sadly.
Not the same city, not for now. Is that a budget document is really kind of like highlighting the key elements. Otherwise, you're going to end up with like a 14,000 page document with every single detail, and people will be poring over it for days. What I do think is disappointing about this particular element is the fact that like we have to kind of, hold on to your laurels. It'll come out in the fall. And, to your point, fall often means just like November 29th. So I think, devil's in the details on this one as well.
But there are no details.
Okay, exactly.
And we've got Canada's Colombo on the path just trying to get a straight answer from our finance minister, also our deputy prime minister. And there's nothing here. And I guess this is where overlapping interests intersect. And I think for the benefit of our audience, we have to I want to use CCI here and your subject matter expertise to create a pathway for them to set this in context, because I'm not sure what they think of when they hear the words Canada Infrastructure Bank, but I know that sets off certain flags and signals in people who track government wheeling and dealings across this country. Like, how would you contextualize this announcement to CCI's members? Maybe let's start there, acknowledging that there are no details.
It's an outline. It's a blank canvas coloring book, and I think Ben's going to talk a little bit about this, but the numbers that Paul is sort of highlighting for people to read up on. There's concern here that this is really about an FDI play and what that looks like, and we have written extensively and talked extensively on that. But Ben always says
FDI being foreign direct investment for our listeners, a very big bugaboo from the CCI crew. Sorry, I couldn't find a way to make that not rhyme, and I apologize deeply.
Yeah, so I think this is the piece where when you kind of first look at the budget, you think, oh, okay, maybe there's something here, and then you kind of begin to sort of go through kind of some of the further details, and really what emerges is just question marks. And I think what we're actually going to have to see is how does this really kind of play out over the next couple of months. And so Dana has already been, feverishly, working to engage the government and figure out, okay, what is this actually going to look like? How do we get involved? How do we participate? And I think that, in its kind of most kind of hopeful and most kind of sort of celebrated form, this potentially is going to unlock capital for Canadian firms at maybe discounted rates or at some sort of opportune structure, right? And that's kind of the most sort of hopeful. I think kind of our kind of scary nightmare scenario is this going to be used as a tool to try and bring in foreign multinational firms into the country to invest dollars. And so that's really what we're kind of in the process of trying to figure out. And I think the fact that you brought up the infrastructure bank, which never really delivered on any of its kind of promises, and some can say that that's because COVID hit and things got muddled, and there were some real challenges there, and they're all valid, right, in terms of those challenges dealing with COVID and such. So I think this is a real wait and see for kind of maybe the totality of the ecosystem, but for us at CCI, this is actually go time. This is really about figuring out what this means. How can we help shape it, and how can we really put it as a tool to help our domestic firms scale up and grow. I will link back to the comments that I made earlier around the government's commitment to figuring out the innovation and productivity gaps. And I'm hopeful that they will link those narratives together in terms of determining what the Canada Growth Fund ultimately does.
Is there any meat we've left on the plate here?
There's one, or at least one I want to talk about.
This is the perfect segue to talk about the Permanent Economic Council.
Boom. Doug, look at you go.
Ding, 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 ding.
Take notes.
So this is where I think there's something kind of interesting. And this is something CCI called for in its budget ask of the federal government. And that's the creation of a permanent Council of Economic Advisors to help strengthen the government, really tackle some of the larger issues. And this is all the things, Doug, that you hate that CCI comes and secretly wants to talk about on your podcast.
Things that you advocated for that are coming to fruition?
No. This is things like IP. This is helping the government understand data and what it means in terms of setting, policies and regulations. This is about setting up, investment arms to make sure that they properly, flow to help, domestic technology companies or Canadian companies. So this, I think, really is potentially, and this is like me being, extremely positive on the government, is that this potentially has the opportunity to be a really useful tool, not just for ISED, but across all of government in terms of determining the economic impact and what this means.
Can I ask why? Because I want to know broadly why, but why specifically is it so hard for the government to speak to people in our industry, our economic space, to understand their needs? I think to his very specific credit, Minister Baines, at the very least, was very good at being on, if not speed dial, DMs with people who were truly in the space. Like, why does the federal government need a council, a permanent economic council, just to talk to former OMERS employees about how innovation policy should be set across the country? Like what is it? What is it about the function of this government or government in general that requires that kind of intermediary?
Yeah. So really, it's about kind of two pieces here. One, government has commissioned, report after report after report in the innovation space that has gone nowhere, and it's often led by very smart, very thoughtful people. The problem is that by not having something that has permanency, there's no ability to kind of hold the feet of the government to what the actual recommendations are. So by actually having a kind of permanent setup structure that constantly is able to give feedback to government, not just based on, a one-off or, a report that's needed on, COVID mitigation, but something that's a living, breathing organization that is able to do deep research, that's able to do deep analysis on what's needed to help strengthen the Canadian economy is really, really critical. This is what countries like Israel does. This is what countries like Finland does. This is what countries like Germany does. And so really being able to have that capacity and in-house expertise within government, I think, is a critical first step. And so how this is laid out and structured will matter. What industries are included, what aren't, and looking at how robust is its reporting system and its actual kind of teeth in terms of what it's able to do. All those things will matter. But I think that from what the council put forward, we're kind of seeing the green shoots of what we really wanted in terms of that being able to exist. The other quick thing I'll just say is that innovation policy is actually iterative, right? It's not something that you just do once and then forget it. It's something you have to do again and again and again and again. And so being able to actually build up that repository and that timeline of information is critical. And a permanent advisory council is kind of the way to do it.
Okay. This might sound like a trolley question, but I mean it sincerely.
Yeah.
Isn't this what our Senate is for?
No, not so much. I mean, the move on making senators independent, like a lot of them. I mean, you've had Colin Deacon on here before, Senator Deacon,
friend of the pod. I'm legally required to say that each time.
Yeah, it's his tagline. It's been trademarked. And we were, he's a friend of CCI's as well. But I think, that's a much more formal, and here's my legalese kind of coming out. That's a much more formal, tradition of how legislation, typically gets passed. And, to Ben's point, I don't think they have necessarily that they have the kind of the teeth or maybe the freedoms that an economic council like this will be able to have. But I do just want to add and pile on to Ben's point. So not really to your question. I think that there's tradition in both houses. Look at how things are set up in different Commonwealth systems, but it is going to be absolutely essential that people who understand the data-driven economy are a part of this council, because if that is neglected, we're in big trouble all over again. Talking about what we talked about earlier, every company now is a tech company. We need to have the capacity, and this is, I hope, what this Economic Council points to, building capacity inside government to advise government and give the recommendations and steer them in the right way. Because you got to remember, politicians are still tied to their partisan loyalties. And an economic council like this, if it's standalone and has the right governance structure around it, ought not to be. So I think it's just going to be critical in how it's set up, who's on the council, what the tenure looks like. All of those pieces are really going to be critical in terms of it being successful.
Do you guys want to talk about IP for 5 minutes?
Sure. We love IP.
Sorry, we're out of time. I want to thank CCI for coming. Really appreciate you making this work. And somehow we turned what was supposed to be a very targeted conversation into a really insightful 60 minutes on things that I think our audience is really going to benefit from learning about, because this is only the start. The Beta Kid podcast is produced by Beta Kid Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKid.